Blood dries sticky on cheap linoleum. Most scrub it away pretending the stain never existed. Nora just steps over it. She's used to ghosts. But when a matte black helicopter shakes the hospital windows and tactical operators demand her by a name she buried years ago, those ghosts finally catch up. Iodine always smells like rust and burnt matches. Nora rubbed a rough, alcohol-soaked cotton pad over the antecubital fossa of the man in bed 4. She ignored the way his papery, jaundiced skin tore slightly under the medical tape, focusing instead on the bruised vein rolling just beneath the surface. She didn't tap it. She didn't coax it. She just sank the 18-gauge needle in with a fluid mechanical thrust. Flash of dark blood. Catheter advanced. Flush. Tape. Done. She adjusted the flow rate on the saline bag. 52 drops a minute. Simple math. Civilian math. Hey, float. We need bed 4 cleared 10 minutes ago. Nora didn't flinch. She just wiped a smear of blood off her thumb and turned to face Brenda. The charge nurse stood in the doorway, a tyrant armed with a heavily decorated clipboard and a breath that permanently smelled of stale vanilla creamer and resentment. Patient's heart rate is resting at 110, Brenda. Nora said, her voice a flat, unbothered monotone. He's mildly tachycardic. Pushing him out to the waiting room before the fluids stabilize him is a liability. He's a frequent flyer looking for a warm bed. Brenda snapped her rubber-soled clogs squeaking against the linoleum as she stepped into the cramped bay. And you are the float pool nurse, which means you discharge when I say discharge and you restock the crash carts when I say restock. We don't pay you to play attending physician. Nora held Brenda's glare for 3 seconds. Empathy was a muscle Nora had intentionally let atrophy years ago. She didn't care about Brenda's petty kingdom. She didn't care about the hospital's bed turnover metrics. She cared about the 52 drops a minute, and the fact that her lower back was radiating a dull, familiar ache from a piece of shrapnel she'd caught in a life she no longer lived. Understood, Nora muttered, breaking eye contact. She grabbed her plastic supply tray. Subservience was a cheap currency, and Nora spent it freely to remain invisible. Floating was the perfect gig for a ghost. You showed up, wore the generic navy blue scrubs, took the worst assignments, and left before anyone bothered to learn your last name. You didn't join the union. You didn't go to the staff holiday parties. Most importantly, you didn't stay in one department long enough for anyone to notice the puckered, jagged scar climbing up the left side of your neck, or ask why a simple civilian nurse moved with the hypervigilant silence of a hunted animal. Stepping out of bed 4, Nora was immediately swallowed by the sensory barrage of the Level 1 Trauma Center. It was 2:14 a.m. The ER smelled of industrial citrus cleaner, fighting a losing battle against the odors of stale vomit, digested blood, and unwashed bodies. A monitor in bed 7 chirped a relentless B-flat drone. A drunk in the hallway was singing loudly off-key while handcuffed to a rail. Hayes. Nora stopped. Dr. Wyatt was waving a chart at her from the central nurses' station. Wyatt was a third-year resident who wore too much hair gel, drove a car his parents paid for, and treated nurses like voice-activated meat drones. Look at this, Wyatt said, tossing an EKG printout onto the desk as Nora approached. He didn't look up from his phone. Bed 2, chest pain. The scans are clean, enzymes are normal. I'm diagnosing it as severe acid reflux. Get him a GI cocktail and prep his discharge papers. Nora picked up the EKG. The paper felt cheap and flimsy between her calloused fingers. She scanned the jagged black lines. Standard sinus rhythm. Mostly. But there on the third lead, a tiny, almost imperceptible ST depression. It was the kind of ghost blip that didn't trigger the machine's automated alarms. The kind of blip you only noticed if you had watched 100 men die. He's sweating, Dr. Wyatt, Nora said quietly. I walked past his bay, diaphoretic, ashy skin tone, and he's complaining of pain radiating to his jaw, not just his chest. Wyatt finally looked up his brow, furrowing in irritation. He had spicy food for dinner, Hayes. It's reflux. It could be a subtle non-STEMI. Nora offered, deliberately keeping her tone deferential. She knew how to play the game. Never wound the ego of a man with a stethoscope. Maybe we just hold him for a repeat troponin draw in an hour just to cover your ass. Wyatt scoffed, snatching the EKG back. Are you interpreting strips now? Because I'm pretty sure your badge says R and not MD. Give him the cocktail. That's an order. Nora looked at Wyatt's clean, uncalloused hands. She thought about arguing. She thought about slamming his gelled head into the laminate counter and explaining exactly what myocardial ischemia looked like in a dying 20-year-old on a dusty tarmac. Instead, she blinked. She let her shoulders slump, adopting the posture of a tired, defeated float nurse. "Right away, doctor," she said. She walked toward the medication room, the cheap fabric of her scrubs chafing against her collarbone. She would give the patient the cocktail, but she would also quietly run a secondary IV line and slide a baby aspirin under his tongue when Wyatt wasn't looking. She would save the man's life in the shadows, let the arrogant resident take the credit, and clock out at 6 a.m. That was the routine. That was the survival mechanism. Keep your head down. Do the work. Stay dead. Until the building began to shake. It started as a vibration in the molars. Nora was in the supply closet counting boxes of blue-top Vacutainer tubes when the rhythmic, concussive thud reached her. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a physical pressure pushing against the hospital's reinforced concrete. The rattling followed. The metal shelving vibrated. A box of syringes vibrated right off the edge, hitting the floor with a hollow plastic clatter. Nora froze. The hairs on her forearms stood up. Hospitals had helicopters. Medevac choppers like the EC-135 were a daily occurrence, bringing in car crash victims with a high-pitched, whiny chop. This wasn't an EC-135. This was heavy, twin-engine, massive rotor blades cutting through the dense, humid city air with a violent, chest-thumping whump, whump, whump. It sounded like a modified MH-60M Blackhawk. Military grade. No, Nora thought, her breathing hitching slightly. Not here. You're in Chicago. You're a civilian. Outside the supply closet, the ER had fallen completely silent. The drunk stopped singing. The monitors seemed to fade into the background. The low-frequency rumble grew deafening, rattling the glass of the ambulance bay doors until it seemed like they would shatter. The chopper wasn't landing on the roof helipad. It was landing directly in the street outside the trauma bays. Nora stepped out of the closet just as the automated glass doors of the E blew open. A chaotic swirl of trash grit and the overpowering stench of combusted jet fuel ripped through the pristine waiting room. Brenda screamed, throwing her arms up to shield her face from the debris. Dr. Wyatt stumbled backward, dropping his tablet. Out of the dust, 3 figures emerged. They weren't paramedics. They were massive, moving with a terrifying, synchronized urgency. They wore dirt-caked tactical gear plate carriers void of any identifying patches and night vision mounts flipped up on scarred helmets. They smelled of diesel-stale sweat and the sharp, coppery tang of massive blood loss. The man in the center was being half-carried, half-dragged. His uniform was saturated a horrific, glistening crimson from the waist down. "We need a trauma bay now!" The lead operator roared. His voice cut through the ambient noise like a serrated blade. He was holding a blood-soaked combat gauze against the wounded man's junctional femoral artery, his knuckles white from the pressure. The civilian staff remained paralyzed. The sheer kinetic violence of the operator's entry had short-circuited their protocol-driven brains. "Hey!" Dr. Wyatt finally found his voice, stepping forward with his hands raised in a pathetic attempt at authority. "You can't bring him in here like that. We need to triage." The lead operator didn't slow down. He didn't even look at Wyatt. He just dropped his shoulder and slammed into the resident, sending Wyatt crashing into a row of rolling vital sign machines. "He's bleeding out from a high-caliber GSW to the groin," the operator barked, dragging the casualty toward the nearest empty bed. "Tourniquet failed. The artery is retracted. He's going into hypovolemic shock." Brenda rushed forward, her clipboard shaking. "Sir, we need to log him into the system. Where is your commanding officer? I am calling security." The second operator, a giant of a man with a sniper veil wrapped around his neck, stepped between Brenda and the stretcher. He didn't raise his weapon, but the cold, dead-eyed stare he gave her made the charge nurse physically recoil. "Shut up and move!" the sniper growled. The lead operator dumped the casualty onto bed 1. The wounded man was deathly pale, his lips blue, his chest barely rising. "We need O negative," the lead operator shouted to the room of frozen civilians. "We need a massive transfusion protocol TXA and a trauma surgeon right fucking now!" Wyatt scrambled to his feet, furious and trembling. "I am the attending resident. You will step back and let me assess the patient." Wyatt grabbed a pair of trauma shears and reached for the casualty's leg. The lead operator caught Wyatt's wrist, his grip snapping tight enough to bruise bone. "If you touch him, you'll kill him," the operator said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. "You don't know how to pack a blast wound." "Then who does—" Wyatt yelled, trying to yank his arm away. The operator let go, his frantic eyes scanning the paralyzed room. He ignored the doctors. He ignored the security guards cautiously approaching from the hallway. "Where is she?" the operator demanded, his voice cracking with desperation. "We tracked the emergency beacon to this grid. Where is Sparrow?" Brenda blinked, bewildered. "Sparrow. We don't have a doctor named Sparrow. I don't know what—" "Not a doctor." The operator interrupted, his breathing heavy. "Call sign Sparrow. Nora Hayes. Where the hell is she?" At the back of the room near the supply closet, the box of blue-top tubes slipped from Nora's hands. It hit the floor, scattering dozens of plastic vials across the linoleum. The sharp clatter drew every eye in the room. Nora stood frozen for a fraction of a second. She looked at Wyatt, rubbing his wrist in indignation. She looked at Brenda, staring at her in utter confusion. And then she looked at the lead operator. She recognized the broad shoulders. She recognized the faded scar cutting through his left eyebrow. Briggs. It was Briggs. And the man bleeding out on the table was Cole. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the ER, broken only by the slowing, erratic beep of the casualty's heart monitor. Nora closed her eyes. The ache in her back flared. The ghost she had spent 4 years outrunning had finally caught her. She took a slow, deep breath, smelling the familiar, toxic perfume of iodine blood and war. When she opened her eyes, the tired, slouching float nurse was gone. Nora stepped over the scattered plastic tubes. Her stride changed. The deference vanished, replaced by a rigid, predatory focus. She didn't walk toward the bed. She took command of the room before she even reached it. "Brenda, activate the massive transfusion protocol. 4 units O-neg now." Nora barked, her voice echoing off the tile with absolute, undeniable authority. "Wyatt, push 2 grams of TXA and grab me a central line kit. Move—" Wyatt stared at her, dumbfounded. "Hayes, what are you doing? You're just afloat. I said move your ass." "Wyatt." Nora roared, the sheer force of it making the resident physically flinch. She reached the bed. Briggs looked at her, his tough, dirt-stained face instantly slackening with relief. He stepped back, without a word surrendering the space to her. Nora didn't look at Briggs. She stared down at the catastrophic wound. The civilian world melted away. "Talk to me, Briggs." Nora said, her hands snapping on a pair of latex gloves. "How long has he been bleeding?" 20 minutes. Briggs replied, falling naturally into the rhythm of her command. "Pressure dressing failed in flight. We couldn't get a clamp on the bleeder, because he's missing half his pelvic floor." Nora muttered, her hands diving directly into the pool of hot, slick blood without hesitation. She didn't rely on monitors. She felt the erratic flutter of Cole's femoral pulse with her bare fingertips. "I need combat gauze, all of it, and someone get me a goddamn scalpel." The ER staff watched in stunned, breathless silence. The nobody in navy blue, the quiet, annoying float nurse they had ignored for months, was standing elbow-deep in a shattered soldier barking orders to elite operators who deferred to her like she was a god. And she was just getting started. Blood is a terrible lubricant. It turns latex gloves into slick, useless second skins, rendering any attempt at fine motor control nearly impossible. Nora didn't ask for a towel. She didn't have the seconds to spare. She plunged her right hand deep into the catastrophic void of Cole's upper thigh, her fingertips bypassing shredded muscle and jagged bone fragments. She wasn't looking at the wound. Her eyes were locked onto the far wall, staring blankly at a peeling hospital safety poster. She was visualizing the anatomy, blindly relying entirely on spatial memory and the frantic, desperate drumming of her own heart. Suction. Nora demanded, her voice flat, stripped of the panic vibrating through the rest of the room. "The canister is going to fill in 10 seconds. Brenda, bypass the wall unit. Hook up the portable suction and dump the reservoir into the sink when it tops out. Do not let this cavity fill up." Brenda, completely stripped of her administrative bravado, scrambled to comply. Her clogs squeaked frantically as she hauled the heavy plastic machine over her hands, trembling so badly she fumbled the rigid plastic tubing. "Wyatt!" Nora didn't yell. The terrifying calmness in her tone froze the resident mid-step. He stood holding the central line kit, his face the color of wet cement, staring at the geyser of dark, arterial blood pulsing between Nora's forearms. I have the kit." Wyatt stammered, his gelled hair falling across his sweating forehead. "I don't need the kit right now." Nora set her jaw tight. Her index finger brushed against something thick and rubbery deep within the tissue. The severed artery. It had retracted violently into the pelvis, a defensive mechanism that was currently bleeding Cole out internally. "I need you to drop that, put on sterile gloves, and get your hands in here. I need retraction, now." Wyatt swallowed hard. "I'm not a surgeon, Hayes. I don't—" "He doesn't have time for your imposter syndrome." Briggs barked from the foot of the bed. The operator had his rifle slung tight across his chest, his eyes manic and bloodshot. "Do what she says or get the hell out of the way." Wyatt hastily snapped on a pair of oversized gloves and stepped to the bedside. The smell hit him instantly. The heavy metallic stench of hemoglobin mixed with the acrid odor of the explosive residue baked into Cole's uniform. Wyatt dry heaved, turning his head away. "Look at me," Nora commanded. Wyatt forced his eyes up. "Grab the retractor. Pull the inguinal ligament superior and lateral. Pull hard. If you think you're pulling too hard, pull harder. Break his ribs if you have to, just give me an inch of visual clearance." Wyatt gripped the metal retractor and pulled. Cole's massive frame shifted on the gurney. Nora felt the tissue stretch. The pool of blood deepened. "Clamp," she snapped, extending her left hand. Gage, the sniper who had silenced Brenda minutes earlier, immediately slapped a long, curved Kelly clamp into Nora's palm with the precise, practiced force of an operating room technician. The operators knew her rhythm. They had lived it in the dust of Kandahar, in the mud of the Congo. Nora fed the steel clamp into the dark cavity, using her right index finger as a guide rail. It was completely blind. She felt the heavy, erratic thud of Cole's fading pulse against her knuckle. "Come on, you stubborn bastard!" She thought the cynical civilian facade cracking, letting the raw, desperate operative bleed through. "Don't you dare die on this cheap linoleum. You owe me $20. She positioned the jaws of the clamp over the pulsing rubbery hose. She took a breath, held it and squeezed. The steel jaws clicked shut. Ratchet 1. Ratchet 2. Ratchet 3. Instantly, the relentless welling flow of crimson slowed to a sluggish seep. Nora kept her hands locked in place, her forearms rigid. She didn't exhale. She stared at the monitor above the bed. The blood pressure readout, previously flashing a terrifying 50/0 slowly ticked up. 62. 68. I have proximal control. Nora whispered. It wasn't a boast. It was a statement of survival. She looked at Brenda, who was practically sitting on the floor, frantically squeezing a bag of O-negative blood into the massive IV line Gage had managed to establish in Cole's jugular. Keep squeezing, Brenda. Squeeze it like it owes you money. Brenda offered a ragged, hysterical sob, but her hands clamped down harder on the plastic bag. Nora finally looked at Cole's face. The thick tactical beard couldn't hide the waxy, translucent pallor of his skin. His eyelids were parted, showing only the whites of his eyes. He smelled like cordite and old sweat. He smelled like the life she had run away from. She hated him for being here. She hated Briggs for bringing him here. This hospital was her purgatory, a quiet, miserable place where she could count inventory, take orders from inferior doctors, and pretend the things she had done in the shadows never happened. But as the blood soaked through the knees of her scrubs, sticking to her skin with a cold, terrifying familiarity, she felt the intoxicating, horrific surge of adrenaline. The ghost wasn't just awake. It was starving. He needs a vascular surgeon to repair the artery. Nora said, her voice clinical, detached. She looked at Wyatt, who was still holding the retractor, his arms shaking from the exertion. And he needs an exploratory laparotomy to check for bowel perforation from the blast wave. Page Dr. Stanton. Tell him to prep OR3 for a massive trauma. Stanton is on his way down. Wyatt gasped, sweat dripping off his nose and landing on the sterile drapes. He's in the elevator. Good. Nora didn't move her hand from the clamp. If she twitched, the artery could slip, and Cole would bleed out in 30 seconds. Briggs, how long has the TXA been in? 10 minutes. Briggs replied, his massive hands resting on the rails of the gurney, gripping the plastic so tightly the metal groaned. Sparrow, is he going to make it? Nora looked at her old team leader. The invincible, stone-cold assaulter looked fragile under the harsh, buzzing glare of the hospital lights. I don't know, Briggs, Nora said, refusing to offer the comforting lie a civilian nurse would give. She gave him the grim, tactical reality. He lost at least 3 liters. The clamp is holding, but his coagulopathy is going to be a nightmare. It's a coin toss. Briggs nodded slowly, accepting the math. He didn't thank her. There was no need. The double doors of the trauma bay flew open, slamming against the magnetic wall stops with a violent crack. Dr. Stanton, the chief of trauma surgery, sprinted into the room, followed by an entourage of residents and surgical nurses. Stanton was a veteran surgeon, a man used to controlling chaos, but he stopped dead in his tracks. His level 1 trauma bay looked like a war zone. 2 towering tactical operators in blood-soaked gear were guarding a patient. The charge nurse was weeping in the corner, covered in blood, manually pumping a rapid transfusion. Dr. Wyatt looked like he was about to pass out, and standing at the epicenter, her hands buried deep in a man's shattered pelvis, was Hayes, the quiet, sullen float pool nurse who usually restocked the alcohol swabs and avoided eye contact. What in God's name is happening here? Stanton demanded, his eyes darting across the monitors. Nora didn't look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the surgical field. Adult male high-velocity gunshot, wound to the right groin with severe junctional hemorrhage. Nora rattled off the cadence of her voice, identical to a military sit-rep. Tourniquet failure in the field. Massive transfusion protocol initiated. 4 units packed red cells, 2 of plasma 1 gram TXA on board. I have blind clamping of the retracted right femoral artery. He is stabilized for transport, but the clamp is precarious. He needs your operating room right now, Dr. Stanton. Stanton stared at her, his brain struggling to reconcile the data coming out of the mouth of a low-tier employee. He walked to the bedside, peering into the wound cavity. He saw the steel clamp locked flawlessly onto the retracted vessel in a pool of blood so deep a normal surgeon would have struggled to find it with a flashlight and suction. "You clamped it blind," Stanton asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It wasn't going to clamp itself," Nora replied coldly. "Take the retractor from Wyatt. I need to transfer my grip to you." Transferring the clamp took exactly 14 seconds, but to Nora it felt like an agonizing hour. Once Stanton's gloved hands secured the heavy steel instrument, Nora slowly withdrew her hands from the cavity. They came out coated in a thick, drying layer of rust-colored gore. She took a step back from the gurney. Her boot slipped slightly on a puddle of blood, but she caught her balance. The room erupted into controlled chaos. With Stanton taking the lead, the surgical team swarmed the bed. Wyatt was shoved aside. Brenda was relieved of the blood bag by a fresh nurse. "Move him!" Stanton yelled. "OR3, let's go, let's go!" The gurney unlocked. The wheels squealed against the linoleum, leaving dark, smeared tracks, as the surgical team rushed Cole out of the bay and down the hall toward the surgical elevators. Gage and Briggs immediately fell into step behind the gurney, forming a tactical perimeter around the surgical team, their eyes scanning the pristine hospital corridors for threats that didn't exist here. Briggs stopped just before he reached the doors. He turned back, looking across the devastated trauma bay at Nora. She stood alone by the sink, her shoulders slumped, the rigid military posture vanishing as rapidly as it had appeared. She looked exhausted. She looked old. "We didn't know where else to go, Nora," Briggs said, his rough voice carrying over the hum of the idle medical equipment. "The op went bad. We were off-grid. The transponder pinged your location. You were the closest exfil." Nora didn't turn around. She stared at herself in the small mirror above the scrub sink. Her hair was matted to her forehead. Her pale skin was speckled with tiny red droplets. "I'm not Sparrow anymore, Briggs," she whispered, though she knew he could hear her. "I died in Mosul. You know that." "Sparrow saved Cole's life tonight," Briggs said quietly. "The float nurse couldn't have done that." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and jogged after the gurney, his heavy boots echoing down the hallway until the sound faded completely. Silence crashed back into the ER bay. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet. Nora slowly reached down and turned on the faucet. The water was violently cold. She thrust her hands under the stream, grabbing a bristled surgical brush. She scrubbed. She pressed the abrasive bristles into her cuticles, dragging them across her knuckles, tearing at her own skin to get the blood off. The water in the stainless steel basin turned a bright, horrific pink, swirling down the drain in a mesmerizing vortex. Behind her she heard the shuffling of feet. She didn't look. She just kept scrubbing the stiff bristles, scraping audibly against her skin. "Hayes." It was Wyatt. His voice was small, stripped of all the arrogant Ivy League entitlement he usually carried. It was the voice of a boy who had just realized monsters were real, and one of them had been fetching him coffee. "Don't," Nora said, her voice sharp, cutting him off before he could form an apology or a question. She turned off the water. Her hands were raw red and shaking violently. The adrenaline crash was hitting her now, a tidal wave of nausea and bone-deep fatigue that made her knees threaten to buckle. She grabbed a rough paper towel and dried her hands. Brenda was standing near the doorway, holding her clipboard like a shield. The charge nurse was staring at Nora with a mixture of absolute terror and bewildered awe. "Nora," Brenda started, her voice trembling. Who are you?" Nora looked at the charge nurse. She thought about the petty reprimands, the terrible schedules, the snide comments about her lack of ambition. She realized none of it mattered anymore. The sanctuary was burned. The cover was blown. The government would be here in an hour to scrub the hospital's security footage and enforce non-disclosure agreements, but she could never walk these halls again. Nora reached up to the collar of her scrub top. She unclipped her plastic hospital ID badge, the one that simply read N, Hayes RN Float Pool. She tossed it onto the bloody laminate counter next to Wyatt's discarded EKG printout. It landed with a dull, hollow clack. "Nobody," Nora said, her voice a hollow, cynical rasp. She walked past Wyatt, who physically shrank back to give her space. She walked past Brenda, ignoring the charge nurse's wide, fearful eyes. She pushed through the swinging double doors, stepping out into the cold, quiet hallway of the hospital, leaving the mess, the blood, and the civilian world behind her. The ghost was awake, and it was time to disappear again. Nora couldn't hide from her past, and now the ghost operative is awake. Will she disappear again, or will the military drag her back into the shadows for one last mission? If you loved this intense, pulse-pounding medical thriller, show some love. Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below. What call sign would you choose for yourself? Share this video with a friend and stay tuned for the next intense ride.